Europe's got a parliament. It's not a very strong parliament, but it does have a parliament. It's got a very, very well-developed civil service. They've already gone a long way to creating a single market for trade in goods and services. There's a high degree of labor mobility across the Eurozone. And there are still questions as to whether they've really got enough political integration in place to make monetary policy in Europe a very smooth-running thing at the moment. And we are nowhere near that. Nor, of course, in North America do we have the deeper historical forces that have pushed the European project. You know, we haven't had 100 years of wars that we don't want to repeat, to put it as simply as possible. Well, I think because there are drawbacks as well as advantages to any kind of integration like that in North America. Some of them come from history, and some of them come from the structure of the economy. Now, let me just give you one example which really goes to the exchange rate issue and any kind of common currency or fixed exchange rate issue between Canada and the US. The US is a major importer of commodities. Canada is a major exporter of commodities. When there is a commodity boom, the real exchange rate between the US and Canada has to vary. Now, if you don't have a nominal exchange rate between two currencies to bring about some of that adjustment, it's got to come through in other ways, and that means it's going to have to come through in changes in domestic prices and domestic wages. You would take some of that strain off if you had a labor market integration, because then the stresses in the labor market would lead to north-south labor mobility as well as east-west labor mobility. But we don't have that at the moment. And if you bring Mexico into the picture at this point, let me remind you that from the US point of view, the NAFTA arrangements were there to cut down labor mobility from Mexico into the United States. Mexican immigration was creating political problems, so the argument was, let's create the jobs in Mexico and take the stress off there. Well, if, you know, one of your principal aims of your trade policy is to cut down on labor mobility, it's pretty far-fetched to think that you can superimpose a common currency on top of that. So I think that the really difficult thing about a common currency for North America, frankly, is US-Mexican relations. That's the big obstacle. On the Canadian side, similar obstacles are there, but I don't think they're nearly as large. In Canada, you may remember, around about 1999, 2000, 2001, there was a flurry of discussion about whether Canada should try to join the Federal Reserve System and make the Bank of Canada the 13th District Bank. I had the impression a lot of people didn't realize that that would have meant you would have had to denationalize the Bank of Canada and sell it to the chartered banks. The US system is a very, very complicated system. It's got a complicated history. It grows out of American politics, and the politics of money and banking in the United States has got this strong populist streak in it that goes at least back to Andrew Jackson and maybe even back to the Revolution, as far as I know. In the First World War, almost every country in the world abandoned the gold standard. The United States didn't. Okay, because the United States wasn't a combatant until 1917, so it didn't suffer the same stresses. The monetary history of the interwar years you can think of as being a history of failed and often quite damaging attempts to re-establish the gold standard. Then World War II breaks out, and there is no international monetary system anymore. Everything is on a command basis for, wartime economies. After the war, or even during the war, the statesmen who were looking forward to what the post-war world was going to look like wanted to re-establish market economies, and the market economy needed an international monetary system. I won't say they could start from a completely clean slate, but they were able to start from a slate that had lots of blank spaces in it, at least, and they designed a new international monetary system. How can you reconcile pegged exchange rates with the political necessity of elected governments addressing local economic problems using monetary and fiscal policy? So it became a system of adjustable pegged exchange rates that was supposed to be supervised by the IMF. Well, it it sort of worked. What really caused it to break down was that the key currency of the system, failing Keynes's international central bank, the key currency of the system was the US dollar. So long as US macroeconomic policy was stable and pursued, low inflation, reasonably high employment, which is what you had under Eisenhower, the system didn't work so badly. But when the Vietnam War broke out and the Kennedy tax cuts came in, and then Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, the US began to generate fiscal deficits, and those fiscal deficits in the US undermined the stability of the US dollar right at the center of the system. And, in due course, the system collapsed in the early 70s. And we've been improvising ever since. From the point of view of Canada, I think the status quo has been pretty good, as I say, subject to the way things are going to work out in the next couple of years, and nobody's quite sure about that. For the US, I'm not so sure. I mean, the US has really piled up a lot of debt. The US inflation performance has not been good relative to Canada's. I sometimes think that the US would be better off if it had had an inflation targeting regime like Canada's. But I'm not quite certain about that because, of course, the US dollar is an international currency in the way in which the Canadian dollar isn't. And that complicates the US policy problems. And, Americans get enough lectures from Canadians about how to run their economy. They don't need more lectures from me on that one.